And in your book, you talk about a scenario that I'm sure many teachers can relate to, which is where you're teaching a lesson and the children seem to get it. They seem to understand it. They're performing well. They're getting questions right. And then you return to that lesson, say, days, weeks, months later, and it's as if they haven't been taught it before. They can't recall much. They don't seem to remember much. So in that lesson, the first lesson, they seem to have performed well, but later it doesn't seem like they've learned anything. So can you explain the difference between performance and learning?
Well, in psychology, there's a very clear difference. Performance is how well students do in the learning task, and the learning is the change in long-term memory that happens as a result of that task. Mm-hmm. And we used to think that they were pretty similar. But in the second half of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, two researchers, Robert Bjork and John Sweller, cast considerable doubt over that as being a useful view of what's going on. So Robert Bjork pointed out that the relationship between learning and performance tended to be inverse. In other words, the better that students performed in the learning task, the less long-term learning took place. So students often seem to be successful in a task, but if they're not really struggling a little bit, Robert Bjork uses the phrase desirable difficulties. And Daniel Wiliam summarizes this by saying that memory is the residue of thought. If students aren't struggling a little bit, then they're probably not engaged enough for this to become part of their long-term memory. Mm. But around about the same time, John Sweller was finding something that looks contradictory. What he found was that students could be actively and successfully engaged in, for example, mathematical problem solving. They could solve the mathematical problems they were set, and yet they learned nothing about problem solving. They didn't get any better at problem solving. And his explanation for this was that sometimes when students have to think too hard, the cognitive load overwhelms their mental resources, and so long-term memories are not formed. Right. So the point is that there can be two things going wrong. One is that it's not hard enough. It doesn't make the students struggle enough. Mm-hmm. And the other is it's too hard, and it makes the students struggle too much. And so we need to be looking for this Goldilocks point all the time, mm-hmm. this idea that students need to be struggling, but not so much that it becomes counterproductive. Right. And so I don't think we'll actually crack this in the foreseeable future. It's going to be a piece of teacher craft knowledge. The best teachers are going to be better at judging how to make this hard enough, but not too hard for students. Right. But I think the crucial takeaway, and I think that this is why I've described cognitive load theory as the single most important thing for teachers to know, is that students can be successfully engaged in a valuable task in a classroom and learn nothing as a result. Mm. And if schools were primarily there as child monitoring services, that would be okay. But I'm kind of old-fashioned about this. I quite like the idea that kids learn stuff in school. They come out of classrooms, knowing stuff that they didn't know when they went in, and they remember that stuff for a long time. Yeah. So if our goal is learning, and I think it should be, then we have to be very aware of the fact that performance is not the same as learning, and there's often an inverse relationship between the two.
Right.